Well, thank you very much for having me on this historic day in the United States. Cybersecurity is obviously a top priority, a top national priority,
Mhm.
and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, as well as the Director of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, have all announced that there have been increased threats from malicious cyber actors, particularly emanating out of the Russian Federation as well as Iran, and to a lesser degree, the People's Republic of China.
Mm.
So nefarious foreign interference continues to be a threat. I think the country is well prepared to mitigate those threats. But again, there's no security system that is 100% foolproof 100% of the time.
Mhm. So, what role do you think misinformation plays in today's elections, particularly in states with heightened political tensions? And how can it affect public trust in national security policies?
Well, misinformation and disinformation spread by foreign actors is quite candidly not a new phenomenon. These things have been going on for decades during the Cold War, for instance,
Hmm.
and since then. The added twist, the added level of complexity now, given the ever connected world that we live in, with all the cyber connections and all the cyber threats out there, certainly make the threat more heightened.
Mhm.
And they serve to, and frankly, pour fuel on the fire of certain aspects of public discontent and public misconceptions that we've seen, again, not just recently, but in years before. So it makes the problem more complex and more complicated to deal with.
Mhm. So, how significant are today's turnout numbers in determining the future U.S. foreign policy direction, particularly in how Washington engages China, Russia, and North Korea?
So foreign policy is usually not a top priority for American voters. Most Americans usually vote based on economic issues and social issues, and I think that is still the case.
Mhm.
However, we find ourselves now in late 2024 facing two major conflicts, one in Europe, one in the Middle East, that have certainly amplified some voters' participation in the election.
Mhm.
When we look at the news coming out of Ukraine that North Korea has sent forces to fight alongside the Russians, that only adds to the fact that this war in Europe is arousing additional concerns here in the United States. So foreign policy and defense issues, particularly in light of these wars and the overarching failure of deterrence over the last 3+ years, is motivating some Americans to vote in certain directions, perhaps more so than has been the case in previous election cycles.
Mhm. Sir, in your own opinion, could today's election outcomes lead to shifts in security cooperation or defense priorities with countries in East Asia region? If so, in what ways?
I think, generally speaking, there is great alignment between the Democratic and Republican parties on what's referred to as the China challenge. It may be one of the only issues in Washington, D.C., that has a bipartisan consensus that the United States, in conjunction with its partners and allies, need to be able to stand up to Chinese aggression and face the challenge in a unified way.
So, how will the results of today's election affect the United States' commitment to preserve Europe's strategic security structure within the framework of NATO? And will the election results determine whether NATO support for Ukraine will continue?
There is certainly a difference in approach between former President Trump and Vice President Harris in terms of NATO and Ukraine. That being said, let's remember that the first lethal support to Ukraine was provided by President Trump and his administration, whereas the Obama administration, the Obama Biden administration in 2014 provided no real assistance of consequence to Ukraine after the Crimean annexation. Trump will hold NATO to the standards it has set for itself in terms of defense spending. And we saw the trend lines actually improve, that NATO member states started to invest more in their own defense as well as in the collective defense of the alliance during the Trump administration. Yes, additional improvements have been made in that regard since Russia's invasion of 2022. I think President Trump will be harder on NATO than Vice President Harris will be, to ensure that all NATO members live up to the commitments that they have made.
So, reflecting on your time overseeing U.S. defense policy, how do you perceive the relationship between domestic election outcomes and global perceptions of U.S. security reliability? How might today's events shape this perception?
Well, there is a perception internationally that the United States has a tendency to become isolationist, meaning it reverts back to its own borders, protected by two oceans, if you will, and two friendly neighbors. There is some truth to that. I think Americans, for the most part, tend to be more concerned about domestic issues than international issues. But let's also take history as a guide. The United States, on many occasions in its history, both in long ago and more recently, has come to the fore to take leadership positions when other countries were either unwilling or unable to do so. So, as I mentioned earlier, foreign policy does not usually get Americans to the polls, but the fact that we find ourselves right now in an era where we are facing the breakdown of deterrence, we are seeing major wars killing literally thousands of people on a daily basis, I think is going to motivate some Americans to vote in certain ways.
So, given your background in national security, what are the most pressing security concerns on Election Day? How well prepared do you think states are to address these threats?
Well, as you know, the United States, even though it's a national election, that state agencies have certain responsibilities in terms of securing the electoral process. And as I mentioned before, some of the national agencies have issued warnings about some of the foreign threats that are intended to perhaps spread misinformation and disinformation. I think the national security agencies, in conjunction with state agencies, will again take all steps possible to mitigate some of those malicious foreign actors from trying to interfere in the U.S. election. However, again, as I stated, it is very difficult to be able to eliminate all threats all the time.
Well, how have federal and state governments balanced local autonomy with national security interests on Election Day? Are there specific states where this balance has been particularly evident?
So, again, with respect to the national and state level coordination, it varies. There are certain states, I think, where, based on the 2020 election and the fact that there were some mishaps, for instance, in Georgia and in Pennsylvania, that's heightened investments at the state level in trying to secure the electoral process even further, as well as trying to make it a more efficient and effective process.
As the world is watching closely this presidential race, what differences are you observing across states today in terms of security preparations? What do these tell us about the overall readiness of law enforcement agencies to confront any potential unrest related to the electoral process?
Well, it's been reported that in some states, the National Guard has been called up to buttress local law enforcement in case of unrest. I'm not aware of any reports of any unrest. We have to remember also that the election is ongoing and it's
Yeah,
still relatively early.
definitely.
Initial results will not be announced until late into the evening today.
Yeah.
But part of the issue, of course, is every state has a different process and there are different timelines associated with that.